fiscal cliff. A deal that would avoid a recession for now, a temporary reprieve for a struggling U.S. economy. But when it came to cuts in defense and non-defense spending, simply postponed for 2 months. Well, in this news analysis, we will dissect this cliff, U.S.'s economy, and how at the heart of all of this should lie the American people, and whether they will be the ones who are going to pay the price once all the issues are resolved.
On this vote, the yeas are 257. The nays are 167. The motion is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
A face-saving compromise for U.S. politicians. In a last-ditch effort, American lawmakers approved a controversial Senate bill aimed at staving off the swinging cuts and soaring tax rates of the so-called fiscal cliff. 172 Democrats and 85 Republicans voted in favor of the bill. The late-night House vote took place less than 24 hours after the Senate passed the measure in the pre-dawn hours of New Year's Day. But the question many ask is what on earth the months-long dispute over the measure means for Americans.
This is activity to keep the mind of the public focused on irrelevant activities of the government. These problems could be solved overnight, but there's not the will to do that.
Mr. Akaka.
The agreement reached by the Senate would see tax rates rise for individuals earning more than $400,000 per year. The figure is higher than the $250,000 threshold originally demanded by President Barack Obama and his fellow Democrats.
Thanks to the votes of Democrats and Republicans in Congress, I will sign a law that raises taxes on the wealthiest 2% of Americans, while preventing a middle-class tax hike that could have sent the economy back into recession and obviously had a severe impact on families all across America.
All the same, it's not only affluent Americans who face tax rises. Under the new bill, taxes on 160 million Americans, many of them middle class or poor, will indeed rise by 2%. Supporters of the bill in both parties said it fell far short of a sweeping plan that combined tax changes and spending cuts to reduce federal deficits.
It does little to actually address the deficit situation. And this is now the bigger talk in Washington is how is Washington going to cut down on its growing debt? Of course, this latest compromise only cuts the debt about $650 billion. If this fiscal cliff did happen, it would have cut the deficit by about $4.6 trillion. So there's a huge difference there.
America's deficit stood well above $1 trillion in 2012 for the fourth year in a row. The country's national debt is over $16 trillion now and is continuing to rise. The new legislation postpones for 2 months the deep federal spending cuts, a central worry of the fiscal cliff. Analysts warn that the delay could set up another fiscal cliff in late February.
Let's find out what our guests think about this deal. Let me introduce them. We have Eric Draitser, who joins us. He's the founder of StopImperialism.com. From Washington, Roland Amora. He's an economist and political commentator. And from London, we have Max Kaiser, a journalist and broadcaster, joining us. Gentlemen, welcome. Roland Amora, I'd like to start with you. Maybe you can explain this to us because, well, it seems like taxes have increased. Inheritance tax by 5% to 40%, capital taxes to rise, the payroll tax, holiday tax for 160 million Americans to rise from 4.2% to 6.2%. So what was this thing that Obama was touting about that it was a victory for the middle-class Americans?
Well, look, his contention has been this, that incomes of $250,000 and above should be taxed at a higher rate, both for capital gains, dividends, and also for income. The compromise was reached at $400,000 or $450,000 per family income. Basically, yes, indeed, the payroll taxes will be up by 2 percentage points across the board. But the real tax cuts that stayed in place from the original tax cuts are from incomes below $400,000. So there is a shift in the tax cut curve based on that.
Max Kaiser, lots of names have been thrown around about this deal. Reuters came out and said a dud on deficit front. Then we have this David Buick is a senior strategist at Cantor Index. A fudge deal is what he called it, and that there's going to be more deficit problems to come. What would you call this deal?
Well, I think they need better metaphors than fiscal cliff. It's more like a bottomless pit. It's a bottomless pit of debt. You notice the debt numbers keep rising because there is no fiscal responsibility. And I noticed that Obama's big supporters in Hollywood and the hedge fund industries got huge tax breaks, tax subsidies. So if you're a friend of Obama, he gives you a big wet kiss and some free tax abatements. If you're not a friend of Obama, then go stand in the food line or a soup kitchen and pound sand, because he's not interested.
Max Kaiser touches Eric Dreitzer on what seems to be something that's really being forgotten, and that's the origin of this entire debate, is to reduce these swollen federal deficits. I mean, didn't this deal sort of kick this can down the road, so to speak, to a later date? I mean, what kind of deal is that if it's not tackling the major issue?
Well, yes, it does delay the actual response to the real crisis, but I think it also mischaracterizes what the real crisis is. There's two ways of thinking about this. Either we're talking about a debt and a fiscal problem, or we're talking about a deeper fundamental problem with the economy in the United States. And I would, of course, believe in the latter. I think the real problems are those of poverty, those of social injustice, and other issues which are not actually addressed by any so-called fiscal cliff, which itself is a manufactured problem. But yes, it's true that this was really kicking the can down the road and not terribly far. What we're looking at is another fight shaping up for about 8 to 10 weeks from now, in which we're going to see the cuts that we did not see in this deal. There was much fear around Washington and around the country that, in fact, we would see savage cuts to the social safety net, to Social Security, Medicare, and other necessary social programs. And though we didn't see all of those cuts in this deal, it's likely that we will, because we have another manufactured crisis which has been set up, that being the debt ceiling and then the question of sequestration. And the sequestration issue, which is going to come up very soon, this is going to be where the Republicans and their Democratic co-conspirators are going to be able to gouge those economic rights that the American people have enjoyed for a generation or more. So that's really the issue here. It's not so much about the deal, and as Mr. Kaiser was correct in pointing out, it is subsidies and bailouts and further giveaways to Obama's friends at Goldman Sachs, at JP Morgan, in Hollywood and elsewhere. And I would also mention that there are many more sweet deals in there, such as extending the loopholes for offshore corporations, minimizing the capital gains tax, and so forth. So this is a deal that is loaded with pitfalls, loaded with problems, and of course another fake solution to a manufactured crisis in the United States.
Well, the word I picked up there, Roland Amar, from our guest Eric Dreitzer, is manufactured crisis, manufactured debt. What do you think?
Yeah, you know what? I have to agree with him, and I have to agree with Max. And basically, the crisis was manufactured. It was manufactured by Ben Bernanke. He's the first to coin the term. Look, our problems are deeper than this. They need to be addressed. The problems of spending, the problems of amassing more and more government debt exceed the fiscal cliff issue. It is somewhat of a smokescreen. But yes, in 2 months, we will have to start facing the sequestering, the mandated cuts.
Max Kaiser, let's talk about this spending. I mean, it's really not that complicated when you think about it in some respects, that pretty much isn't this because of Obama's spending? I mean, he's known to be the biggest U.S. president in terms of the biggest spender, $1 trillion again for the year, adding to the debt. And what is going to have Obama used as a platform in order for him to justify the spending, which seems like that's not something he's going to budge on?
Well, Obama spends, for every tax dollar that's raised in America, Obama spends about $1.40. And that number keeps rising. And the country is diving into this bottomless pit of debt. And of course, the one thing that they won't cut, the biggest expense, is the Pentagon. And this is going to be a big problem now because China and Japan look like they're going to go on a war footing. And of course, America is allied with Japan, but China is the country that is financing America's debt. In other words, when America takes on more debt than they do able to collect in taxes, the difference is paid for and financed by China. So as long as China finances America, then America can continue to pretend as if they can spend more than they take in by an incredible percentage, one of the worst ever in the G20 countries, in the history of the G20 countries. But as soon as Japan and China start to get more actively involved in a hot war, not a currency war, but a shooting war, which looks like it's coming now in 2013, then we're going to see currency collapse. The US dollar will collapse because China won't finance it anymore. And that's the risk that we're talking about, the risk that Obama does not tell his population. And that's unconscionable. That's a lack of leadership. As an American, it's embarrassing to have a president who's such a coward, who won't talk to his people honestly about the true risks of his profligacy and his lack of leadership and who he's really working for. Vested interests of Wall Street, the entertainment industry, and the military contractors. I say to this guy, grow a pair, talk to the people like human beings, and don't be so quick to bomb people with drones instead of having a coherent foreign policy. Grow up!
Let's expand on that more, Eric Draitser. I mean, one of the biggest areas is, well, they call it defense, really, but in some sense it should be called offense because the U.S., let's look at some of the announcements they have made. Their actual deployment of its troops to 35 African nations. And that, in some sense, is to counter China's influence. And that's as early as next year they're going to do that. For that matter, of course, their increase in Central Asia. And on last count, the U.S. military, well, they're deployed in 150 countries around the world. Shouldn't this area be on the chopping block?
Well, of course it should be, but the reason why it's not is obvious. I think it's self-evident, in fact, that Obama, just like Bush and Clinton and Bush and Reagan and all of the presidents before them, going back 2 generations, are beholden to the interests on Wall Street as well as the interests within the military-industrial complex. If you notice this fiscal deal, we see no significant cuts to the military budget. We see no change in tack from this imperialist agenda in Syria, in Africa, as you mentioned, and elsewhere. And it's important to remember also that President Obama is pretty much the most successful president in terms of selling war to the American people, and in particular selling out those who call themselves Obama supporters, those who make up his base. We see no conversation from Obama during the election or after regarding the issues of poverty or really regarding actual substantive solutions to problems like unemployment. And again, I want to come back to the deal that was struck here. We should remember that the propaganda, the rhetoric is saying that we have no tax increases on the middle class, when in fact this is a lie. This is a propaganda ploy. The fact that they allowed the payroll tax holiday to expire means in effect that middle class people, those who are wage earners, are going to lose money directly out of their paychecks. So as I mentioned earlier, this is an illusion. It is an illusory solution to this problem. And just as we see with the sequestration issue, military spending, the Pentagon budget, and so forth, these will not be cut to any significant degree. Those programs that will be cut, will be gouged by Obama, will be things like food stamps, Medicare, and the other social programs which many people in this country truly depend on. And I choose not to get involved in these economic abstractions. I much prefer to talk about economic realism. Those 50 million people in the United States who are very much subject to these programs and whose lives are very much dependent on them, they need them to survive. And Obama, just like his Republican collaborators, has no interest in supporting them or in creating any kind of solutions. And it's for that reason that Obama is the perfect representative of Wall Street and London and international neoliberal capitalism.
Well, Max Kaiser, since our guest there talked about how media and print media is portraying this, was interesting how this was presented to the media. I mean, the White House gave no particular figures for how much it would bring down the deficit, stating only that somehow with a strengthening economy that it would. Why wouldn't they release figures? And of course, more importantly, does U.S.'s economic data support a flourishing economy to come?
Well, we've already talked about the reason why, because the media in America is corporate-owned, and it is pretty much taking their direction from the White House. Certainly an outlet like Fox News takes its marching orders directly from the Pentagon and the White House. The Fox News is a state-run media outlet in all but name. And this is a funny figure that they came up with, that the taxes rates are going to go up for people making over $400,000 or $450,000. Of course, because of the money printing necessary to keep the debts intact going forward, a lot of people will start to make $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year. It's called inflation. And but of course, a cup of coffee will cost $100,000, and a cost of an education will cost several $1,000,000, because that's what happens in a hyperinflationary economy like the U.S. is heading into, because they're letting the debts expand exponentially. And the Federal Reserve Bank, they have a remit now, as all the G7 nations have signed on to this idea, that they can simply print billions. And in the case of Japan, they're going to print 1 quadrillion in fresh yen, according to the new leader in Japan, to force inflation into the economy, which means that the purchasing power for all these countries and all these populations crashes. And we see proof positive in the price of gold and silver, which of course are the only real true honest money out there, but they are the barometer by which you can judge the failure of these policies around the world. And as they continue to move up, it's a clear indication that the Obama administration's economic policies are a failure, as are all the G7 countries.
Eric Dreitzer, you say you want to keep away from any type of economic equations, perhaps, to explain this. So let's focus on what this is going to mean for America, not in the short term, but, I would say maybe you can clarify for us or elaborate more on how this is going to erode, in some sense, the middle class, as it's been doing, who's been falling now to the lower class and even below, with the numbers 50 million to be on food stamp, not to mention the unemployed people who, well, for the ages of 18 to 25, is set to be 20 to 25%, if not higher. How do you see then the future for the U.S., where there's going to be a breaking point?
Well, I think that the future is certainly bleak, and let's take each one of those different sectors in the economy. For one, we have young people graduating from universities unable to find jobs, and the only thing that they can find is a letter in their mailbox telling them how many tens of thousands of dollars they owe, the massive debt that they really have little chance of ever repaying. So you can imagine what sorts of economic problems that generation faces with nothing but debt to show for their years in universities. Now, if we look at homeowners, for example, we don't really see any solutions coming out of Washington from either the Republicans or Democrats with regard to those people who are upside down on their homes, who are losing their homes to foreclosure. We don't see a moratorium on foreclosures or anything even approaching that. In fact, we see quite the opposite. We see continued giveaways to those banks and financial institutions which are essentially predatorily attacking these homeowners. If we take the elderly, we see people losing their access to senior centers. We see Medicare being gouged. We see an attack on all these various social services and social programs. So it should be self-evident, as I mentioned, how this erodes the social fabric. And then we should remember also that this is something that can take 10, 15, 20 years to rear its ugly head. And what kind of an impact will this have on society in, let's say, 2033, when we have an entirely new generation getting ready to retire, one that has never been able to enjoy the fruits of many of these social programs. And let's also point out that the Republicans are, of course, disingenuous when they claim that they have any interest in the middle class. Their interest is in eroding the social safety net that has been in place now for 70-plus years. And there are many people on Wall Street, in Washington, and around the world who applaud this mentality. And this is, of course, deplorable. There are many countries, as Max Kaiser pointed out, there are many countries that are following this exact same model, and they're not not simply the G7 and they're not simply in Europe. We can see a very similar economic model being laid out in South Africa. We can see it all in many other parts of the world. So the attack on the social safety net will result in the destruction of the social fabric, and that will have far-reaching implications well beyond the balance sheets and those on Wall Street.
And one of the most alarming stats, Max Kaiser, when we look at all the different ones, is well, before the fiscal cliff, it was said that every U.S. household owes, about $140,000 to the national debt, and that's rising. Explain that for us, and how this is going to, some say, by some accounts, that it's going to be passed on to the next generation, these debts that each household owes.
Well, the way that America and these other countries can ring up debts that are hundreds of percentage points greater than their gross domestic product is by keeping interest rates near 0%. The central banks like the Federal Reserve or the ECB or the Bank of Japan or Bank of England have all coordinated their activities. They collude, which is anti-competitive, to keep interest rates near 0%. And at the same time, they have off-balance sheet accounts, what they call the shadow banking system, which is now around the world, if you count it all up, worth $69 trillion. So the value is greater than the entire world's GDP. And this debt is orbiting, if you will, the planet and waiting to fall in a most spectacular wave of hyperinflation the second that interest rates start to go up. And what will start the interest rates going up is when one country, it could be China, it could be Japan, says they're not going to play this game of financial chicken anymore, and they're going to default on their bonds. That means interest rates go higher, which will set off a chain reaction of global fiat currency collapse. And this is what people in America know very, very well. That's why the very rich in America are buying assets like fine art, like gold and silver, like diamonds, precious metals, because they know that ultimately the hyperinflation is coming, the currency collapse is coming because of the catastrophe that they engineered, and they will be ruling the world, so to speak. We're going to go back to really an economic system that you'd have to go back to feudalism to find something similar. The incredible disparity between the top and everybody else in the economy. It's neo-feudalism, and it's being engineered by people around the world. And we see the results today. Poverty is skyrocketing. Food stamp use is skyrocketing. But take a company like J.P. Morgan, for example. Not only are they involved in shadow banking with the Federal Reserve Bank on Washington and Wall Street, but they're also the biggest purveyor of food stamps in America. So people in America who are having their purchasing power completely decimated by J.P. Morgan's loans and shadow banking and money printing have to go to J.P. Morgan to get their food stamps processed. So this is really, Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan is really, he's a brilliant financial architect of evil, where people end up always paying Jamie at the end of the day. Jamie always gets paid.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Let me thank our guest, Eric Greitzer, is founder of StopImperialism.com. Also, Roland Amora, economist and political commentator. And you were just listening to Max Kaiser there. He's a journalist and broadcaster from London. Thank you so much for watching another edition of the Press TV News Analysis. Do send us any comments or questions. Newsroom@presstv.r is our email address. From me, Kaveh Tafway, and the entire team, it's goodbye.